Okay, good morning, Dad. Today
Morning.
is Friday, December 13th. And did you see Netanyahu's address to Iran yesterday?
Actually, I didn't.
You
No,
didn't?
so you can
Okay.
tell me about it.
Actually, I'll go ahead and play it for you. It's a little long, but I think it's worth watching. So
Okay.
let's try it.
People of Iran, as we see history unfold before our very eyes, I can only imagine what you're feeling right now. Your oppressors spent over $30 billion supporting Assad in Syria. Today, after only 11 days of fighting, his regime collapsed into the dust. Your oppressors spent billions supporting Hamas in Gaza. Today, their regime lies in ruins. Your oppressors spent over $20 billion supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. In a matter of weeks, most of Hezbollah's leaders, its rockets, and thousands of its terrorists went up in smoke. The money your oppressors stole from you literally went up in smoke. You must be furious imagining the new roads, schools, hospitals that could have been built with the tens of billions of dollars your dictators wasted backing terrorists who lose over and over and over again. Do you know why Iran's oppressors keep losing? It's not only because they're incompetent and cruel. They are. It's because they seek to conquer other nations, to impose fundamentalist tyranny on the Middle East, on the entire world. The only thing Israel seeks is to defend our state. But in so doing, we're defending civilization against barbarism. The historic events we witness today are a chain reaction to the pounding of Hamas, the decimation of Hezbollah, the targeting of Nasrallah, the blows we delivered to the Iran regime's axis of terror. And all this came, as President Trump pointed out this week, because of Israel and its fighting success. I want to make clear, Israel wants peace. We want peace with all those who truly want peace with us. And I have no doubt that you, the people of Iran, know this. I know that just as we want peace with you, you want peace with us. But you suffer under the rule of a regime that subjugates you and threatens us. You know what this regime is truly terrified of? It's terrified of you, the people of Iran. And one day, I know that, one day this will change. One day Iran will be free. Women, life, freedom, zan, zandagi, azadi. That is the future of Iran. That is the future of peace. And I have no doubt that we will realize that future together a lot sooner than people think. I know, and I believe, we will transform the Middle East into a beacon of prosperity, progress, and peace. Thank you.
Okay, a bit long, but I
Yeah.
thought it was worth listening. So what's
Yeah.
your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, this is a very skillful politician. He really knows how to work his audiences. I always get that feeling when he's speaking to the American people. He understands Americans, and of course, he speaks in perfect American accented English, which makes it even better. Yeah, I think he's clearly trying to foment division within Iran. I know I mentioned earlier that there always has been criticism of within Iran of the government's support of the axis of resistance. They feel you should be focusing on what's happening here at home. Forget Hezbollah and the Palestinians and all that. That's not our concern. So there's always been that faction, and I think he sees an opportunity to simply exacerbate this division. And I think that's what it's all about. And, it may actually have the vast majority of people are not going to listen to him and regard him as the devil, and I think correctly so. But it could have some effect.
Do you think the way that he said that this change might be coming a lot sooner than you think, do you think that this is kind of a preamble to an all-out conflict with Iran, that there's going to be a strike on Iran soon from Israel? They are running high on what's happened in Syria, and now it's their time to make a move. Do you think that's what's happening?
I think that's certainly possible. Yeah, there are reports that an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities is in the planning, and it would be a combined U.S.-Israeli attack. That's what I've heard. I don't know if it's supposed to take place before the inauguration on January 20th or after, but and it may very well be true. I mean, the reasoning behind the attack, it's really the fall of Syria. And they say the fall of Syria has weakened Iran. It's also increased the chance that Iran will go for nuclear weapons, which may be true. And it also has made attacks on Iran easier because they don't have to take into account, the air defenses of Syria. It used to be they would have to fly around them, and it simply made these attacks more challenging. But as far, if the information that I have about the most recent strike is true, it's not going to do any good, even if the U.S. is involved directly. I mean, Iran, I believe, has very strong air defenses. And again, it's the air defenses that really are designed to deal with the threat from Israel and the U.S. They have missiles that can shoot down aircraft really quite effectively. And that's really what Israel in particular, and the U.S. to a lesser degree, depend on, is actually aircraft that can come in and then, either fire short-range air-to-ground missiles or drop bombs. And Iran can just simply prevent that. Again, they have sufficiently sophisticated air defenses to defend against that. So I think, and then furthermore, their nuclear facilities. Again, we don't have any evidence that they've been used for developing a nuclear weapon. I mean, the last time the Americans believed that they did was 2003. And others, such as Gareth Porter, I think have argued very convincingly that they didn't actually, even in 2003, they didn't have that intention or under consideration. So, just a reminder, this is often we talk about their nuclear program. Let's understand it's a civilian nuclear program. But the civilian nuclear program is largely underground. It's because they know that it's a target of the United States and Israel. And so they prepared for this, again, over decades. So I just don't think that it would do very much. I don't know, maybe some missiles will get through. Maybe some missiles may hit a target, but it'll do very little damage.
Do you think when Netanyahu was giving that address, was he really addressing the Iranian people more, or was it more the American people?
Again, he knows he may get a fraction. I doubt it, actually. Professor Mohammad Morandi of Tehran University has described how, he's always actually had pro-Western students in his classes, which I find still amazing, after all the sanctions, all the cruelty, the assassinations and so forth. But that has largely evaporated. I mean, there used to be a pro-Western faction. It's relatively small, but it could be influential. It's among the educated classes. And that's virtually vanished because of the genocide in Gaza. So I think his audience is pretty much gone. Now, what he's saying about, wasting money on supporting Syria and Hezbollah, actually, that's an argument that's made within Iran, and he's echoing. But the fact that he's echoing it, to be truthful, probably doesn't help those people. Because, again, the hatred of Israel is so strong now. And, not just because of what they've done in Gaza, but the assassination of Hania, for example, on Inauguration Day and other things. Of course, it's gone on for years, the constant assassination, terrorist attacks, and so on and so forth. The hatred is so strong that actually having Netanyahu support your position is probably going to undermine your position, come to think of it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think you're probably right. In the end, it's sort of maybe he's so full of himself, he thinks he really can convince a portion of the Iranian population, but he always has, the United States audience. That he knows that's that's the 800-pound gorilla. That's what allows him to just act with impunity.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm wondering because the last time Israel tried to carry out an attack on Iran, it was basically completely neutralized. They couldn't get into Iranian airspace. As far as we could see, there wasn't really any substantial damage done. And they had to use U.S. air refueling. Okay, now they can fly over Syria more easily because there's not as much air defense to worry about. But they still can't get into Iranian airspace. So
Right.
even if you fly over Syria, maybe, I don't know, maybe they don't need the refueling now or something, but they still have the same issue. So I don't see how this
Right. I don't see it
helps
either.
them. But
Right.
the way he's talking, it sounds like, he's saying that there's something's brewing. And kind of what we've seen in Syria is to destroy a nation, you don't need to do it militarily. If there are ways to bring down a country, what we saw in Syria was insane. 11
Yeah.
days, a
Right.
country collapsed. Of course,
Right.
there's a lot of rot. The sanctions really crippled it. I think when we look at countries like Russia and Iran, the fact that they've withstood the sanctions so long means that they're kind of impervious to that type
Right.
of, manipulation because they've survived for so long. But it just made me think that they're either he's planning something or he's got some assurance from the United States. And you mentioned Trump in there, how Trump's finding success, that Trump might be, the U.S. might be involved more, that we might really go after Iran this time. Do you think that's, what are your
Yeah, I
thoughts
think
on
that's
that?
very possible. I think that's even likely. And then you don't forget that he has always, for decades, has always pointed to Iran as like the ultimate enemy of Israel, the arch enemy of Israel that has to be brought down. And I think that that's something it would be the crowning achievement of his life, the way he looks at it, if he could bring down Iran. So he's not going to give up on that. And he probably has, certainly has been greatly emboldened and encouraged by the recent events. Yeah, so I mean, he was always wanted to get Iran, and now he's probably just feeling confident. Maybe he was hearing, getting some resistance within the IDF. Again, they just tend to be more realistic within the military forces. And perhaps some of that has ebbed away after the sudden success, so-called within Syria. They just saying, well, maybe this guy really knows what he's talking about. Maybe, we're just destined for victory. So, some people maybe were resisting, decided to shut up. And the path is clear to another attack on Iran.
How do you think this would play out, though? Do you think that they would try a similar attack as before, wait for an Iranian retaliation, try to draw on the U.S.? It's all about drawing in the U.S. at the end of the day.
Yeah, right.
We can't see what they've done, like with the pager attacks in Lebanon, the decapitation strikes, the collapse of Syria by funding various groups or whatever. We don't see that as really a possibility in Iran, right? The only way you can hit Iran...
I really don't. I mean, there are separatist movements in Iran. Iran is a multi-ethnic society, so there's Baluchistan, and there's some other ethnic groups that have from time to time been involved in terrorist activity, separatist activity with the support of the Mossad and the CIA, but they haven't gotten very far. And it seems to me, Iran has been around for a long time, and it's survived. It's been constantly under siege in one way or the other, starting with the Iran-Iraq war that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iranians, somewhere from 200,000 to 500,000. And, they suffer the use of chemical weapons, and then there's just sanctions and assassinations and very large-scale terrorist attacks and constant demonization. And it's gone on a lot longer than actually the sanctions that Syria was subjected to. Those began in 2011, basically. Or, we'll say maybe not the sanctions, but the foreign-funded uprising insurgency began in 2011. So Syria was under siege starting in about 2011. And it's a much smaller country, much less populous. And right next to Israel, which is a problem, and Turkey, as it turned out. But Iran is, yes, a much larger country, a more powerful country, and it's absorbed all these attacks on it over time, and is actually now growing stronger. Syria was growing weaker. Syria was, was hollowed out. But that's not true of Iran. Actually, the Iranian economy has turned around in the last couple of years, and they have reasons to be very hopeful. They've joined BRICS, and they now have very good ties with China and Russia, and they kind of come in from the cold. Okay, they've given up on the West, but they found that the West isn't the only game in town. Things have changed. The world has changed, and it really is. And it means a brighter future in Iran.
Right. Well, when I look at the U.S. empire and how it controls and subjugates the world, I feel like it has three arms. There's the economic arm, the financial arm, being able to sanction people, trying to cut people off the U.S. financial system. There is the military arm. And then the third one, I think, is the more sort of evil arm, is the covert sort of terrorist regime change CIA type of operation arm. So those are the three. But the first two, the economic sanction arm, that's really been kind of dismembered in a large part for larger countries like Iran and Russia have shown that it's different. And so that arm is withering and dying. The same thing with
I would actually add a fourth, and since we got four, maybe we should go to tentacles instead of arms.
Okay, we got four tentacles.
Yeah, the fourth would be soft power, media power.
That's a good
one. That's
one.
actually very important. You can see it at play. It's just very obvious, for example, in the recent cases of Georgia and Romania, Moldova, and so on. And now in Syria. I mean, there's just sort of the obvious attempt to whitewash. And it's sort of like 1984, these were terrorists. Now they're, 3 days later, they're now freedom fighters and diversity sensitive and so forth.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a good arm as well. The soft power arm. But the economic sanction arm, the financial weaponization of the dollar arm is been largely neutralized. It was fully neutralized by Russia and largely neutralized by Iran. I think also the military arm has been largely neutralized as well, as we've seen through the Ukraine war. So that kind of just leaves the other two options, and kind of that address that we saw Netanyahu gave, I guess, is an example of the soft power. But the other one that I think that we're going to be seeing being used more and more by the U.S. empire and its vassals is, unfortunately, I think, is terrorism. I don't think you can really call it anything else.
Right.
I mean, what we're seeing happened in Syria, what we saw with the pagers, what we've seen Ukraine do with the Kroger City Hall attack. It's like this is becoming the new America because sanctions don't work and our military is not as cracked up as what we thought it was. So we can't dictate the world that way. So now what we can do is we can print money and fund opposition groups and media, NGOs, terrorist organizations. That's what we're becoming now. And that's sort of the new control mechanism of the American empire. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, well, I think you can certainly see that, like particularly in the case of Ukraine. There's a direct military conflict, but it's one that Russia is winning and will win. And yeah, I think that, but they're not going to give up, and that's probably what they're going to go to, and they've already gone to it to a certain extent already. It's just attempts at, again, funding and training and otherwise supporting terrorist groups within Russia and on Russia's borders. I think you're right. I mean, they're not going to give up. These people are obsessed with these, with their hatred of Russia and of Iran and China to maybe a lesser extent. And if they can't do it one way, they'll try another way. Even if there really is no chance of success, they'll do it because they just feel like they have to do something. That's the kind of people they are. They can't say, okay, we lost. That was a mistake. That didn't work out. It's just that, okay, we can't give up. We just got to throw something else at them. And then at some point, the only thing that they do have to throw at them really is what you're describing, these covert activities.
If we start engaging in these covert activities and terrorist activities more and more, do you think it'll quickly get to the point where it's hard to hide it, that the Western world starts to realize, like, hey, are we the bad guys now? Like, what's going on? Of course, our soft power will do what it can to package it nicely and call them freedom fighters, and the other guys are always terrorists. Where, America and the West are never terrorists. But I think there has to come to a point when people realize, like, hey.
Well, you would hope so. But, it seems like there is less and less of an effort to hide. Partly it's just, and that our propaganda is becoming clumsier and just sort of, I think, just much more easily seen through. That just think about like what's happened in Georgia. I mean, these things were just, okay, the wrong side won, there are protests, and now we have to sanction Georgia and support the protesters. And then in Moldova, the right side won, but actually, we accuse the Georgians of somehow of some kind of electoral fraud, but no evidence is provided. In the case of Moldova, you have an obvious case for electoral fraud. I mean, the largest number of overseas, or we say expatriate Moldovans, are in Russia, but you only give them 2 polling stations, both in the in the embassy within Moscow. And meanwhile, the Western Moldovans, they have 30 times that or something. It was just, I mean, it's so. What can you say? I mean, it's just not, this was just a statement, we're committing electoral fraud. We're doing whatever we can to manipulate the results. And similar efforts were, taken within Transnistria. So the right person won, everything's fine, this is wonderful, this is a victory for democracy. And then you have in Romania, right, there was the anti-EU, kind of Russia-friendly candidate won the first round and was expected to win the second round. So they just simply annulled the election. And there's not a peep out of the Western powers that's saying, oh, no, this is dangerous. We can't do this. We have to support. No, this was a victory for democracy. And I mean, just anybody that just has any kind of sense is going to look at that and say, this is nonsense. This is absurd. But they, I don't remember them being this obvious in the past. And I think partly because maybe they were less ideological. But they've become so ideological that I think they're blinded to their own actions. And they can't see the hypocrisy in there. They really think that they're fighting for democracy. But, anybody who's not swept up in that kind of ideological zeal is not a part of it, outside of the bubble, let's say, looks at it, and it's just glaringly obvious what they're doing. And so I think like Western propaganda is becoming less and less effective as the West becomes increasingly narrow and strident, in its and ideological. So again, we see the same thing in Syria. We could go on and on, but I don't. They don't seem to be even trying to hide it. And like you say, it's becoming increasingly obvious at all levels. But the question is, within the West, will people wake up to it, or are they going to be swept along with this nonsense? And so far, a lot of them seem to be swept along with it and really believe in it. But there is, again, like we've said many times, there are reasons for hope. There are growing dissident movements that, you could say, like within the U.S., it's not so much with foreign policy, unfortunately, but on domestic issues, there is a large segment of the population that really has ceased to believe the media and, ceased to believe the institutions that they were supposed to trust and supposed to guide them. And, and then the propaganda that comes from the other side looks absurd to the people who are outside of it. We have the red-blue split, right? So Red America, the Blue America, announces that, for example, we brought 34 felony charges against the president. He's clearly a felon. And there was a time when if you had the mainstream media telling you something like that, that candidate would have been finished. Because people basically trusted, our authorities, whether they're media or academic or whatever. But it didn't make a difference at all to Red America.
It helped.
They just didn't believe it. A lot of people became a hero for a lot of people,
right.
including a lot of Black Americans. Interestingly enough,
Right. I saw a lot of shirts and bumper stickers. I'm voting for the felon, you know.
Right. Yeah. But I think we can extend that back to just kind of the larger Western propaganda thing. You know, it works within the bubble, that part of Western society that really is the true believers. But you get outside of that, you know, and the rest of the world, and people are just shaking their heads. You know, it's not having an effect. I think, you know, it's a mistake to say that Western propaganda has ceased to be effective around the world. Because you could see, for example, in Georgia, there is it's a minority, but still it's a considerable portion of the population really believes in it. You know, it's hard to understand, but they do. So they do still have power, but I think it's shrinking. There was a time when that color revolution would have succeeded. You know, this time I think you have enough people that have seen through it in places like Georgia, and then you have a government that has seen, you know, the color revolutions play out and know what's going on. So it's, we won't stop doing these things, you know, but, you know, I think they are becoming less effective over time.
Right. And I think as color revolutions fail, it will sow division within the U.S. empire as well. I mean, that's our goal, is to sow division in these countries and support the opposition groups. But I think there is this minority population that is growing within Europe that is becoming aware of this. And I'm wondering if this division that we're going to start to see grow within the West, that ultimately is what's going to bring down the U.S. empire, more so than anything conventionally on the Ukraine battlefield or through Syria and Lebanon.
Right. I think you're right about that. And you know, of course, those things can have an impact. Like what happens in Ukraine could have a huge impact and could end up strengthening those dissident forces. And
right.
Say, hey, you told us, you know, Russia was on the verge of collapse. You told us all it was all false, right? But at the same time, it could have an impact on, you know, the establishment, which has may become, as we see, you know, there's already this tendency, may become increasingly authoritarian, and you know, may start to let's say resort to extra constitutional means to suppress the growing dissent within their societies.
How would you see them doing that? Shutting down things like Our Little Channel? You know?
Yeah, well, I mean, like Romania is a perfect example. You had the Constitutional Court annul the elections. And, you know, later, they didn't give any sort of justification. And they said, well, there was some study about TikTok and whatever. You know,
yeah, always after TikTok.
Yeah, right. And then, because it's not under their control, is what it comes down to. And then the ruling party, you know, the one that probably would have lost power in the elections, actually simply shut down the main opposition television network. It was the only remaining, you know, opposition television network. That's a perfect example of the kind of things that are happening.
So, like in Romania, they're going to have to hold the election again. There's talk, I forget this, can't pronounce the guy's name, but the one that won, but was annulled. There's rumors that he will just not be allowed on the ballot next time. Do you think that's what's going to happen?
They're going to try to disqualify him.
If they do that,
you know, clearly that would be. They'll make every effort to do that, and I'm sure they will do it because I'm sure that a lot of Romanians are greatly angered about this. It's just sort of like the attacks on Trump actually made him more popular. You know, people were angered by it. They were, because they were just transparently political, like these different court cases. And I think most Romanians will probably see that. So the only solution, you know, unless everything will fail if they, you know, all their efforts to place obstacles in his way. Well, he'll overcome those obstacles if they hold the election. He's allowed to run again. He probably will win with, you know, an even greater margin. So they'll do something. They'll find some reason to disqualify him.
Well, we'll see protests on the street, right? I mean, if it's something like this, a lot of Romanians are going to get angry. This is just an example, though. As the empire is losing its grip, it becomes more authoritarian. It's becoming more open and brazen about its regime change operations, color revolutions. People are seeing through it, which is causing more and more people to reject the empire. And And as this goes on, what we've seen, with Western Europe, there's a lot of rot in there that is attributed to NATO and the West. The blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. I mean, that's insane. Yeah. And just the increased energy prices, they're being economically strained because the U.S. is telling them what to do. You got to support them. And most people are like, hey, why don't we try to talk to Putin and have dialogue? If that view was presented, I think most Europeans are like, that makes sense. Instead, I think you're fomenting a collapse within Western Europe. I mean, what we saw in Syria, I don't think we'll see happen in Western Europe. But I mean, Syria was economically constrained with the sanctions. Yeah. They were tightened and weakened and divided, and then it just fell apart. But we're starting to see there's a lot of internal divisions happening within the West now. And I'm wondering, at some point, I think it could start to break up, and then you have the collapse really within the empire from within. There's that rot that's happening there. That it's,
I think
reach a breaking point.
Yeah, I think that's true for the West. For the establishment within the West, that's the greater threat. It really is. Of course, what happens overseas contributes greatly. As you can see in Europe, I mean, this war has had a huge impact on Europe, on European society, and above all, its economy. And as it progresses, I think that impact will only grow. And then a real obvious defeat of Ukraine, again, will send shockwaves through Europe. But in the end, it's not that Russia is going to conquer Europe or anything like that, has any intention to doing anything of the sort. But it may be that Europe itself undergoes some kind of revolution. Let's hope so. I hope so. Europe, I'm probably more hopeful about Europe now than I was, let's say, 5 years ago. Europe just seems so apathetic. But the rise of these parties, both left and right, and I think that's actually a good thing. I think that's actually a very good thing. That's one problem, I think, in the United States, that you find dissents almost completely on the so-called right. And you have
dissent on the right?
Yeah, on the so-called right, yeah.
Yeah, the left is more the establishment party.
Yeah, it really is very much. That may be that tendency within Europe, but no, there are some very important leftist dissident parties, and I think that greatly strengthens, especially if at some point they can begin cooperating with the right. To the present, they refuse to. That's one reason why, if Mélenchon had cooperated with the national rally in France, he would be in a much better position. But you have Mélenchon and the leftists in France, and then you also have the left party in Germany, which I find to be a very attractive party, actually, and I think they understand things very well. I was watching an interview a couple of weeks ago of one of their members, and this was a person that really understood what was going on in the world. You get somebody like Trump, he kind of understands some days, and other days he doesn't. But it was really heartening to see that. They're a minority party, but they're growing in power, and the AfD, they actually have a lot in common with the AfD. They won't communicate with the AfD right now. There's still this kind of taboo, but maybe that'll change, and I think it would be good for both the AfD and for them if they do that. So there's reason to be hopeful about Europe.
Right. Yeah, I just want to say for the left in the United States, they are much, much better on the Israel-Palestine issue, and they're very anti-establishment in that sense. So I don't want to whitewash all the left.
But but they're almost, it's almost completely outside of the Democratic Party, the establishment. There are a few representatives that have shown support for Palestine, and they're on the left, and that's meaningful. But in general, it's more students and so forth. But more power to them. I think again, the Zionism that you find, this really fervent support for Zionism that you find throughout American society, but particularly on the right, is really a stain on the right in the U.S.
Right. Yeah, I hope we can get past these right and left divides and kind of view things more in terms of establishment or hegemony versus multipolarism, But we're seeing. I was just thinking, we're just seeing more and more cracks in the Western Empire. Especially was just thinking about the South Korea situation again. So I was hearing that there's theories at least being thrown out there that it was the U.S. essentially that pushed the president of South Korea to declare martial law because they needed to get weapons to Ukraine. And 82% of South Koreans were against this, didn't want to do this, didn't support it. But this is a pro-U.S. empire president that is our tool. And that makes a little bit of sense to me. He's like, well, why would you just declare what pushed you to make this decision? I felt like there was probably some pressure coming from the U.S. to do this, and then this would give aid to Ukraine. There was also this North Korean story that was being pumped up prior to this as well.
The South Koreans contributed to that too.
Right,
the South Korean government, yeah.
Right, so it's saying that, the North Korea's there. So, and part of what he was saying is saying that there was too many North Korean kind of infiltrators and allies within the South Korean government, and this is one of the reasons he has to declare martial law. And it obviously failed, and I think this could really ricochet on the United States. That this was their plan was to just flip a switch and our vassals do what they tell them to do. We tell them to send arms here, and now we're finding that, hey, you can't just do that. There is a bit of autonomy in these countries, at least. Some, they can't just do whatever they want, go full authoritarian, declare martial law, and just do the bidding of the United States, because the U.S. is getting desperate. They can't provide the artillery shells, they can't do this, so, well, we got the world to do whatever we tell them to do. But it's not working, right? Do you see that happening as well, that South Korea is starting to turn away a bit from the U.S., and I think we will start to see that happening in Western Europe. And at that point, I think the U.S. will start to collapse. And that's where it gets interesting for me. Like, what does that mean? I feel like when an empire collapses, and I don't think this is even really up for debate so much anymore. The U.S. empire is in decline. It's irreversible decline. It is collapsing. And so what comes afterwards? We used to be a republic. We have a system of states. Do you think that we'll maybe break apart into individual states, or is there a possibility we could see something like Syria, where we get chaos in Western Europe or chaos in the United States? Like, how do you see this all playing out?
Right. Well, I think there are actually at least a couple of questions within.
Yeah, it was a bit of a. I'll vomited a little bit on it.
We'll start off with South Korea. I've heard that theory that it was, the coup was launched, the attempted coup was launched at the behest of the United States, especially over the issue of Ukraine. Alexander Mercouris has put that out there. He says, he doesn't know that that's true. But what he says is like he hasn't heard anything that really makes sense. Okay, this doesn't really make sense, but actually makes more sense than anything else that he's heard. And he has a point there. But it has to be said that no evidence has been put forward for this, other than the kind of the mealy-mouthed response of the U.S. during the 6 hours of the attempted coup.
What was the mealy-mouthed response?
Well, it was just it almost was like seemed to be an expression of support. Not made too explicit, but of implicit support for the president. But you might get that even if they were taken by surprise. I think Mearsheimer says that he thinks it's likely that the U.S., like the CIA, had an inkling of what was coming, but he doesn't think that they were directly involved in it. But again, if they really had if they knew that it was coming. And again, if if it was all about democracy, we should have had a very forceful response. Say that this is not this is not what a democracy does, and it would be a kind of a teachable moment or whatever. But that's not what we did. So even I don't think I'm pretty sure that we weren't. I don't think that we were directly involved in it, but we probably did see it coming, and we probably said, hey, this would be good for us. Maybe we can get more artillery shells to Ukraine and, other munitions to Ukraine. Now, Ukraine, I know not Ukraine, but rather South Korea, I think there's still no question it's firmly within the U.S. camp. I mean, they're South Korea is just very closely tied to the U.S. for security reasons, and I don't think that's going to change in a fundamental way. Now, I think this president is almost certainly going to go and be replaced by somebody who's just is more balanced, and maybe will extend the olive branch again to North Korea and to Russia. I mean, it was clear that his hostility to Russia and his zeal for Western hegemony really did hurt South Korea, and I think most South Koreans see that. I think the polls show that his foreign policy was not popular. But I don't think there's any chance that South Korea is going to leave the U.S. camp in the near or medium term. I just don't think that's possible at all. As for the U.S., what may happen is, okay, it may be, let's say I think the best scenario is that we kind of remember who we were. We were a republic. We were a confederation. We were these United States of America. And you actually see stirrings of that even now, that there are different states like Texas or whatever that start to say, maybe we should have our own republic. We have that right. That's what the original contract was, right? We entered into a contract with these other states to become a confederation. And we, agreed to cede certain powers, but we always had the right to leave. Now, that was...
the Civil War.
Yeah, the Civil War, right, kind of decided in favor of, the unitary centralized government. But that memory of of what the United States once was hasn't left us. And sometimes you see it coming back. And, especially if the central government, the dollar collapses, and this, because I think the main power of the central government is its economic power. It's that, it can send these checks to state governments. They subsidize everything. So like it used to be that states were semi-independent, even after the Civil War. They're semi-sovereign, and so much of what was done within the state. But then over time, the central government has kind of got its tentacles in, and by subsidizing universities and various institutions and direct subsidies to state governments, it's just that nobody wants to cut. You say, well, if we do something that angers the central government, that angers Washington, D.C., then we're not going to get this money. And it often decides, a local issue in favor of the federal government's position. But if the federal government loses that power, because the dollar collapses, then everything could change. And we could see a rise of the states. And I think that would be the best thing. It's just that, certain states could break off. Other states could, maybe stay with Washington, D.C., whatever. We could have the best thing would be to have some kind of peaceful secession. Like you saw in Czechoslovakia. It became the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And, not a single shot was fired. And that could have happened in Ukraine, but obviously it didn't. And we're seeing, the tragedy, the alternative, and who knows what would happen in the U.S. I mean, I don't see anything like that happening soon, but things are changing so fast that, I thought I would never see anything like that in my lifetime. But maybe I will. Maybe there will be a real breakdown in authority. That's one thing is that you learn, you think it's easy to believe that these like governments and institutions are permanent. They're like mountains. That's what we used to think of the Soviet Union. It was just always there and always would be there. But they're actually kind of mysterious, intangible things, let's say. It is sort of an invisible glue that holds them together, and it can be very powerful glue, but then one day it just dissolves and we're in a new reality. And that may happen here. I mean, there's obviously like a growing distrust of mainstream institutions that we've talked about. And that's eroding at the foundations of the central government in this country. I think we're still, I don't see that happening anytime in the near future, a real collapse of authority. But, those processes are at play. I think that again, the faith in those central institutions is diminishing, month by month, year by year. And then And then some kind of crisis. At some point, we may realize, hey, it's just not there anymore. People don't trust it, and it's gone.
Right. Right. At the end of the day, it is just kind of a confidence game.
Right.
Confidence game in the U.S. dollar, confidence game in our institutions.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't call it a confidence game, but it is based on confidence, right? And trust. And trust is this mysterious intangible. Often we take it for granted, but we really shouldn't. At some point, it can evaporate, and it's just all over.
Right.
To say that about Syria is that there was real trust in the government and in the army, and but then it evaporated, and it just when it did, it happened with lightning speed.
Right, exactly. I was going to bring that up. Just Syria is a reminder of just how thin that veil between order and chaos is. That nobody saw what was what happened in Syria. Nobody saw that coming, right? And just everything. Sure, there was clearly a rot inside, and I think a lot of people were aware of the rot. People, especially that were watching Syria closely. I wasn't really aware of it because I wasn't paying attention. But people within Syria, and I'm sure people around it, knew that there was rot, and they were able to exploit that. Clearly, the United States is not comparable to Syria in any way, but it is in the sense that there is an internal rot within the U.S. and people see it, and there was clearly a rot within Syria, and that rot allowed it to just crumble and just disintegrate in 11 days. And just thinking that there is this rot within the U.S. empire, within Western Europe, and what Syria showed us, it could just all of a sudden people wake up and then chaos just gets unleashed. I mean, that's possible, right? I mean, I hope not.
Yeah. No, these things can happen. That's right. I'll just say I'm not going to make any predictions. I don't see it happening in the next few years.
Nobody saw Syria.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But yeah, things are changing at such a rapid pace. The world has gotten so crazy, and it's also just our elite. Clearly, it doesn't have the hold. It doesn't have the old deft touch it used to have. It used to be a supremely self-confident elite who, because it was supremely self-confident, could allow for a certain amount of dissent and show a certain amount of tolerance and actually, made it really much more effective. But because I think it's really lost its self-confidence and it's become increasingly, so you see it becoming increasingly narrow and strident and committed to certain ideological principles above all, it's become much more brittle and much less effective. And I don't see any signs that it's going to reconsider its approach. But I think that every sign points to a continuation of that trend, and eventually, I think maybe above all, the elite will self-destruct, through a series of really reckless and ill-considered actions, like potentially a coup or something to save democracy.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was something that was kind of in the cards, already, that we were thinking about with the Trump election. How far will they go to stop him? So I mean, that's a possibility as well. But I want to go back to what you were saying before about the best case scenario, if we can kind of have a peaceful transition back into the federal states, to individual republic again. And you said that really the control that the federal government has over the states is the printing press, is the dollar, that they subsidize, they fund these governments. So any government the state government that wants to break away and says, we're not doing this or whatever, then that funding's cut off. So that just keeps them in check. So do you think that the only way that for a peaceful transition would be a dollar collapse, because then that power is taken away from them?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say the only way. Again, like I said, the history is full of surprises. And economics doesn't determine everything, but that just seems the most obvious way. That's what's, that it seems to me that, the economic cudgel is really what the central government uses to keep the states in line. If they lose that, then they've lost the power to keep in line. And I think we will see secession, in the event of
I won't ask
collapse.
there's been lots of talk about the dollar collapse, and we've talked about it before, this economic time bomb. I won't ask how to ever predict when something like this will happen,
I can't give you an answer on that.
could you give maybe a quick kind of explanation on how a dollar collapse could happen, would happen? Debt gets too high, need to print off money, vicious cycles at it.
One thing is
countries abandoning the dollar.
Right, countries abandoning the dollar. One thing is just, we already see that movement. A lot of central banks are selling dollars and buying gold. That is a trend. So there is clearly some sort of a growing fear around the world that the dollar may not be forever, and a lot of governments around the world are preparing for that day. I think that right there tells you something. It tells you an awful lot that day really will come. And it's a question of when. Now, it's just what, is right now is something on the horizon. At some point, all these trends, these countries moving out of the dollar, it can hit a tipping point for the dollar. And then everyone starts to realize, oh man, the dollar really could fall tomorrow. And then they start, that movement that's been slow and gradual over the course of years or maybe even decades could all of a sudden turn into days and hours. It's just like, if we don't get our money out now, it's just like a bank run, right? If we don't get out of the dollar now, the dollar is because it's clearly what happens as these countries move out of the dollar, the U.S., when they move into the dollar, it buttresses the dollar and it makes the Federal Reserve's job much easier. They don't have to print as much money because it's just being provided by the rest of the world. So they can print money and let's put it
gets absorbed.
They can print money and then it gets absorbed. Exactly. So they're free to print money. They run their printing presses and we can solve all our problems, right? But when they stop, when they begin to move out, then there's, the Federal Reserve is faced with a real problem. They print money and it's not absorbed, and that just is immediately translated into inflation. And then as inflation takes hold, well, that makes the dollar a less desirable currency because, you don't want to buy a currency that loses value over time. Obviously, a lot of countries have put up with it to a certain extent, but as inflation gets worse, they're less likely to do so. And so then you have this vicious cycle, and that vicious cycle gets started. At some point, they're starting to, wait, this is really trending in the wrong direction. We better get out of this quickly before the whole thing falls apart, right?
Right.
And they do. And then it can be something that was a gradual trend, can just start to accelerate, and the support for the dollar is gone, and all those extra dollars that are being printed, they don't have the support of these other countries, that used to be there because of the fact of the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And then you have hyperinflation.
Right.
As the dollar is really gone, it becomes worthless. It becomes like...
right, and if people aren't willing to buy the dollars, typically what a country does is they have to offer a premium. They have to charge higher interest rates for people to take out to borrow, buy as treasury bonds.
Yeah,
but as our debt is so high, the interest rate just causes our debt to go.
That's
so that's the real vicious cycle.
Right, that too. Both of those things, and they're happening at the same time. So we really are depending on this, continued trust in the U.S. dollar. But that trust is being eroded, and at some point, the erosion will be such that, there will be a flight from the dollar, and the whole game will be up.
Right. Yeah, it makes me think that, does a country like China have the ability to tank the dollar if it wanted to? It doesn't want to because it would hurt its own economy.
Right.
But if we're really talking about wanting to go to war with China and focus on China, it just seems so silly to me.
Could. Yeah, I think China more than any other country could do that. And then, of course, we are really very dependent on China for a lot of things.
Even our military.
Even our military. Yeah, there are a lot of things that we need, including our military, that are made in China. And it would be a blow to China if, for example, trade between the U.S. and China just stop one day. Obviously would, and China doesn't want that to happen, and they're going to do what they can to avoid it. But I think it would hurt the U.S. even more. So the idea of having war with China is absurd. I think also like that's one reason China is a cautious member of BRICS. They're trying to they understand that the U.S. is hostile. They've drawn very close to Russia and to Iran, but they do not want to endanger above all economic relations with the U.S. and Europe, for obvious reasons. But over time, I think especially as BRICS grows, the importance of the U.S. Decreases. There was a time, let's say like 20 years ago, definitely, is that the U.S. was like the engine of prosperity for China, for the Chinese economy. It's just like exports to the U.S. So they were not going to do anything. It was just like above all, you don't put that at risk. I don't know what the actual percentages are, but I think that like the percentage of the U.S. as an export market is still very high and very important to them, but it's got to be a lot lower than it was.
Right.
There's a whole other world that's opening up, and over time, it'll make it again. I think China's fear of offending the U.S. of endangering its economic relations with it is going to gradually diminish over time. And the U.S. position is going to be, again, they could just rely on it. There's just no question. China is not going to do anything to endanger its access to the U.S. market. And they still don't want to do that. But at some point, it just may not be, it won't be nearly as important as it once was. And they may make a decision like, we've had it, we can do without the U.S. And then all of a sudden the U.S. will find that it's just like that cudgel that it used to have to threaten China with. It just doesn't scare them anymore.
Okay, we're getting close to an hour, so I just want to ask one more question. It's just about the Russian retaliation to the 6 ATACMS. So I just saw, and I'm sure you saw on the news as well, that Russia carried out a pretty extensive attack against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Do you believe that this was their retaliation?
Well, the Ministry of Defense said that it was. Now, that actually seems to me rather bogus and hard to believe. Because they've done things. I mean, this was a major attack. It was a massive attack, but they've done massive attacks like this in the past. And these kind of attacks, I understand, aren't made on the spur of the moment. They wouldn't have been made in the last couple of days in response to the attack on staff. I think this was in planning. And in fact, I think I saw a report this morning that said that like assets were being moved into place during the 2 weeks leading up to this attack. So they simply decided to call it a retaliation. And I think, let's say one of two things may be going on here. The first possibility is that it was a clear choice not to really respond and to go up the escalation ladder. And this decision was made because of Trump's comments. He condemned the ATACMS attacks.
Right.
And previously, he did not. And especially if there was some kind of background communication, or Trump, sent a message, or his team sent a message to the Kremlin saying that, hey, we think this is stupid. Trump will say it publicly, when he gets into office, that these will end. So please keep that in mind. That may have really happened. And this is something where Trump actually can make good on his word. Like his talks about ending the war in 24 hours, this is all nonsense. He's not going to. Those negotiations are going to fail. I'm going to say that outright. They just have no chance. But this, he could keep his word on this. And one reason for this is that he will have support within the deep state. Remember that the Pentagon was obviously opposed to this, and they fought this tooth and nail for the longest time. And then finally, the crazies in the State Department, Anthony Blinken, he got his way. But Trump will have an ally within the Pentagon. And so it's something he could do. Like he really could say, when he gets in office, he doesn't have to do any legislation. You say, okay, the ATACMS and Storm Shadow, because actually apparently Storm Shadow scouts are dependent on U.S. technology, and I think maybe direct, personnel as well. He could say an end to these attacks, and that would be it. So that may be what happened. And so Russia said, okay, yeah, let's not go up this escalation ladder. We don't need to. Trump's going to be in office, in 20 days or 40 days or something like that. And then it will be all over. So let's not do anything that we, will regret. Another possibility is that this was just, okay, they decided to label this as retaliation because it was massive and it obviously hurt Ukraine. But it's not, they haven't said that this is the whole thing. And there was a story within the Financial Times that said that a Oreshnik attack was expected during the next 2 days. So maybe they'll say this was just the first wave of a retaliation and we may get an Oreshnik. We'll just have to see.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, I'm leaning towards the former, the first one he said with Trump, because it's true. It's something that we said after his the first time they struck into Russia with these long-range missiles. We're like, why isn't Trump saying anything? He needs to stand up. But this time he did. He did. And he said that this is stupid, that, why are we doing this? We shouldn't do this. So hopefully that will allow things to calm down and de-escalate, because the way that it's going right now, if Trump didn't say that and, Russia was really going to, strike and I was afraid that it might get to the point where Russia hits a NATO base within the EU itself, the NATO itself, Romania or Poland, and then I was just thinking, man, all hell's going to break loose, and the possibility of World War III.
Right.
So I'm glad. I hope that this is it.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah, I think it also helped that the attack did so little damage.
Right. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Thank goodness our military sucks.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness for Russia's air defense system, that is just so effective. But if one got through and, let's say, killed a great number of civilians or did very extensive damage, it would be harder for the Russians not to retaliate in a very obvious way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Dad. Any final parting words?
No. Have a good weekend.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good weekend. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.